Imagine getting your dream job, a clean factory, great pay, a bright future. Now imagine that every single day you were unknowingly swallowing poison. Not because of an accident, not because of a mistake, but because your employer told you it was completely safe. In the early 1900s, hundreds of young American women went to work believing they were helping build the future. Instead, they became victims of one of the most shocking industrial disasters in American history. This is the true story of the Radium Girls. America, 1917. The nation was changing at breathtaking speed. Factories were rising across the country. New technologies were transforming everyday life, and scientific discoveries were creating a sense that the impossible was finally becoming possible.
Among those discoveries, one element captured the public's imagination more than almost anything else: radium.
Radium seemed almost magical. It was discovered by Marie and Pierre Curie. It gave off heat. It emitted invisible energy. And perhaps most fascinating of all, it glowed in the dark. To most people, that glow represented progress. Newspapers celebrated it. Scientists raced to study it. Businesses rushed to include it in everything from cosmetics and health tonics to household products. To the public, radium wasn't a warning. It was a miracle. One invention quickly became its greatest commercial success. Very few people questioned whether it might also be dangerous, because at the time, radioactivity was still poorly understood. To the public, radium wasn't a warning. It was a miracle. One invention quickly became its greatest commercial success. Luminous paint. Mixed with tiny amounts of radium, the paint allowed watch dials, clocks, aircraft instruments, and military equipment to glow throughout the night without electricity. For soldiers fighting after sunset, for pilots flying in darkness, and for workers inside dim factories, it seemed revolutionary. Demand exploded almost overnight. Companies received massive government contracts. Factories expanded rapidly. Production lines ran almost non-stop.
But there was one problem. Painting tiny glowing numbers onto watch dials required extraordinary precision. The smallest mistake could ruin an expensive timepiece.
Factories needed workers with incredibly steady hands, exceptional patience, and remarkable attention to detail. Their solution changed hundreds of lives forever. They hired young women. Many were teenagers. Others had only recently graduated from school. For them, these jobs seemed almost unbelievable. Parents encouraged their daughters to apply. Friends convinced friends to join. For many families, this wasn't just another job. It was a chance to build a better future. Every morning, hundreds of young women walked confidently through factory doors. They laughed, they worked, they planned their futures.
None of them had any reason to believe that simply showing up for work would slowly begin a countdown they couldn't see. Because hidden inside those bright, modern factories was a danger no one had warned them about. Lip, dip, paint. 3 simple words.
At first, it sounded like nothing more than a simple instruction. 3 easy steps: lip, dip, paint. Every new employee was taught the exact same routine. Pick up the tiny paintbrush. Shape its tip between your lips until it formed a fine point. Dip it into the glowing radium paint, then carefully paint another tiny number onto the watch dial. And then do it again, and again, and again, hundreds of times, every single day. The paint was expensive. Every drop mattered. A brush that lost its sharp point wasted both time and material. So the companies insisted this method was the fastest and most efficient way to work. The young women followed those instructions without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? The factories looked professional, the supervisors appeared confident, and no one ever suggested the paint could be harmful. There were no warning labels, no safety briefings, no protective masks, no gloves, no special ventilation. Nothing about the job suggested danger. In fact, the glowing paint became part of the factory's culture. At the end of long shifts, tiny specks of luminous dust covered the workers' hands, clothes, and hair. When they walked home after sunset, some of them literally glowed in the dark. Friends admired it, family members were amazed. The workers themselves often laughed about it. To many of them, it felt almost magical. Some brushed the glowing paint onto fingernails before leaving work. Others decorated their dresses for parties. A few even placed tiny amounts on their teeth, just to watch their smiles glow in the darkness. No one imagined they were playing with one of the most dangerous substances known to science. Because the greatest threat wasn't on their skin, it was entering their bodies. Every time they shaped the brush with their lips, microscopic particles of radium were swallowed. Not enough to make them sick immediately, not enough to trigger alarm. Just tiny amounts, repeated over and over again. Hour after hour, day after day, month after month. Inside the body, the radium didn't simply disappear. It behaved in a way almost no one understood at the time. The human body mistook it for something essential, something it needed to survive. Instead of removing it, the body stored it deep inside the bones. And once it settled there, it began releasing radiation from within, silently, patiently. The women continued living their lives, completely unaware that the danger was already inside them. There was no dramatic accident, no explosion, no chemical spill, only an invisible that had already begun. Then, one worker complained about a toothache. It seemed ordinary, something every dentist had seen countless times before. But this toothache would become the first warning sign of a tragedy that medicine had never encountered before. At first, no one thought the illness was connected to the factory. A toothache didn't seem unusual, neither did fatigue or occasional pain in the jaw. Everyone expected the patients to recover, but something was terribly wrong. After one worker had a painful tooth removed, the wound never healed. Days passed, then weeks. Instead of closing, the tissue continued to deteriorate. Soon, the bone underneath began to die.
Dentists were stunned. When they gently examined the jaw, small fragments of bone came away on their instruments.
It wasn't normal. It wasn't something medical textbooks could explain, and it wasn't an isolated case. Another young woman arrived with nearly identical symptoms, then another, and another. Healthy women in their late teens and early 20s were suddenly developing illnesses that experienced doctors had never seen before. The problems spread far beyond their jaws. Some workers became so exhausted they could barely stand. Others developed severe anemia. Many experienced persistent pain throughout their bodies. Then came something even more frightening. Bones began breaking under surprisingly little pressure. A stumble, a simple movement, even everyday activities became dangerous. Their skeletons were slowly losing the strength that should have lasted a lifetime. Families watched in disbelief. Only months earlier, these daughters had been healthy, energetic, and full of plans for the future. Now many struggled just to get out of bed. Parents searched desperately for answers. Doctors argued over possible causes. Some blamed infections, others suspected rare diseases. But none of those explanations fit the growing pattern. Because these women had one thing in common. They all worked in the same kind of factory. They all painted glowing watch dials, and they had all followed the same daily routine. As more cases appeared, physicians began comparing medical records instead of treating each illness as an isolated mystery. The similarities were impossible to ignore. Young age, the same occupation, the same horrifying symptoms. For the first time, a terrifying question began to emerge. What if the miracle material inside those factories was causing all of it? If that were true, this wasn't a medical mystery anymore. It was an industrial disaster. But while doctors were only beginning the dots, the companies already faced a decision that would define their legacy. Tell the truth or protect the business. They chose the business. As more workers became seriously ill, the questions grew impossible to ignore. Why were so many young women developing the same rare symptoms? Why were healthy employees suddenly losing their teeth, their strength, and, in some cases, their lives? Inside company offices, executives were asking those same questions. By the early 1920s, scientific research was beginning to paint a troubling picture. Researchers had started warning that prolonged exposure to radium might not be as harmless as people once believed. The evidence wasn't complete, but it was serious enough to raise concern. Yet inside the dial painting factories, almost nothing changed. The women continued following the same routine: lip, dip, paint, day after day, while they worked with bare hands. Company chemists and laboratory researchers often handled radium under far more controlled conditions, using procedures intended to reduce direct exposure. The contrast was difficult to ignore. The people studying radium understood it deserved caution. The people painting with it every day were never given that same protection. As illnesses spread, public explanations pointed almost anywhere except the paint itself. Some cases were blamed on poor nutrition. Others were linked to unrelated medical conditions. The connection to radium was questioned, delayed, or simply denied. Meanwhile, the women kept getting worse. Many became too weak to continue working.
Medical bills piled up. Families spent their savings searching for treatments that didn't exist. Some women watched friends from the factory fall ill one after another.
Each new diagnosis made the pattern harder to dismiss. But proving the truth wasn't easy. Radium couldn't be seen once it entered the body. Its damage happened slowly, silently. over years. That made doubt easy to create, and doubt gave companies something they desperately needed: time. Time to protect their reputation, time to avoid responsibility, time while the women continued paying the price. But eventually, a few of those women reached a point where they had nothing left to lose. Their health was gone, their careers were over. Some knew they might not have much time left. If the companies refused to tell the truth, they would. What began as a workplace tragedy was about to become one of the most important legal battles in American history. The women knew the odds were against them. They weren't wealthy, they weren't powerful. Most were seriously ill. Some were so weak they could barely leave their homes. Standing across from them were large corporations, backed by experienced lawyers, financial resources, and significant influence. It hardly seemed like a fair fight.
But giving up meant accepting that no one would ever be held responsible. So they chose to fight. One by one, former dial painters stepped forward.
They shared medical records, personal letters, factory employment records, and deeply personal stories of how their lives had been transformed by an invisible danger they never knew existed. Among the most determined was Grace Fryer. She had spent years searching for a lawyer willing to take the case. Many refused. Some believed the companies were simply too powerful to challenge. Others doubted the women could ever prove what had happened. But Grace refused to walk away. Eventually, her persistence paid off. As the legal battle gained momentum, independent scientists and medical experts examined the evidence more closely than ever before, where it continued releasing radiation year after year. The damage didn't stop when the workers left the factory. It continued every single day, from inside their own bones. The evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. Newspapers across the country began reporting the story. What had once been viewed as a series of isolated illnesses was now being recognized as a national scandal. Public sympathy shifted toward the women. Questions grew louder. If companies knew enough to protect their scientists, why hadn't they protected the workers? If the risks existed, why had no one been warned? The case became much bigger than one factory, much bigger than one company. It raised a question that every American worker could understand. What responsibility does an employer have when a job puts people's lives at risk? The answer to that question wouldn't just determine the fate of the Radium Girls. It would help redefine workplace safety across the entire United States. And in the end, their greatest victory wouldn't be measured only in court. It would be measured in the lives of millions of workers who came after them. By the late 1920s, the truth could no longer be buried. Scientific evidence had become overwhelming. The suffering of the women was undeniable, and the nation was finally paying attention. Although many of the Radium Girls would never fully recover, their fight achieved something far greater than anyone had imagined. For the first time, millions of Americans began asking a question that had rarely been considered before. Should workers have the right to know the dangers of their jobs? The answer would reshape the future. The Radium Girls' legal battle became a turning point in American labor history. Their courage helped establish a powerful principle. Companies couldn't ignore workplace hazards and expect to escape responsibility. Over the years, their case influenced stronger occupational health standards, better industrial safety practices, greater transparency about hazardous materials, and more accountability for employers whose workers faced dangerous conditions. Their story also transformed how scientists understood long-term radiation exposure. Miracle Element became one of history's most important lessons about the hidden cost of progress. Their story also transformed how scientists understood long-term radiation exposure. What had once been celebrated as a miracle element became one of history's most important lessons about the hidden cost of progress. Today, more than a century later, the legacy of the Radium Girls is still with us. Every warning label on a hazardous chemical, every employee safety training program, every pair of protective gloves, every workplace regulation designed to keep people safe, exists because generations before us demanded that workers deserved protection, not just productivity. The women who walked into those factories never wanted to become symbols. They weren't activists, they weren't trying to change. Were daughters, sisters, friends, young women chasing the same dream as millions of others: a stable job, a better future. They trusted the people who hired them, and that trust cost many of them everything. But their voices outlived the companies that tried to silence them. Their courage changed laws, changed science, changed the way industries think about worker safety. And perhaps that's why their story still matters today. Because progress is never defined only by the inventions we celebrate. It's defined by how we protect the people who make those inventions possible. The glow of those watch dials has long since faded, but the legacy of the women who painted them still shines. Thank you for watching. For more documentaries, subscribe to the Trending USA documentary channel.